Welcome to our B3 Sciences presentation. In this short presentation, we're going to share with you a scientific breakthrough for training for runners and cyclists. Now, you can train in half the time and half the distance and get better results. Most people who cycle or run are doing the same method for training. Number one, they're lifting weights for strength training. And then they're running or cycling, doing two different types of things. 80% of their training is distance training or volume training. You'll constantly hear a runner or a cyclist talk about how much distance or volume they have to train. And then also they're doing sprints. Now, all of this training leads you to a muscle oxygen deficit. And this is what causes adaptation in muscles. When you exercise and you push your body into failure, failure is either by volume, meaning medium intensity, long duration, or by weight training. Now, as your muscle starts to fail or fatigue, what happens is it runs out of oxygen, and then it eventually switches over and uses lactate for energy, and then lactic acid builds up. The muscle starts to burn and get very tired, and then eventually the muscle fails. This is the type of training most of us have been doing our entire lives. Now, this type of training always comes with a recovery period because of the buildup of lactic acid. And in a lot of athletes, it leads to overuse injury, runner's knee, swimmer's shoulder tendinitis. And this type of training, although we know it can create progress, is slow progress. Why? It's because of the adaptation in the body, and specifically because of the amount of oxygen deficit you can train at. Look at the left side of this screen. This is arm curl exercises. This is no different than getting on a bike or running or doing arm curl exercises. Your muscle oxygen starts at a rest of about 70%. And then as you're going through repetitions, again, as you're swimming, as you're biking, as you're running, as you're curling bicep curls, the muscle eventually fails down around 30% oxygen. This is the typical training that people do that requires recovery and shows slow results. Now, there's a scientific breakthrough for runners as well as swimmers and cyclists. And it's done by putting these BFR bands, stands for blood flow resistance training, by putting these bands on your arms and legs. In over 40 years of research and science out of Japan, it shows that the muscle quickly runs out of oxygen because the deoxygenated blood can't get out as fast. So that's, imagine you're running and you have these bands on your legs. What you're going to notice very quickly is that the muscle's going to start burning much faster, as if you've run much further. Why is that happening? Because the deoxygenated blood can't get out as fast, and the muscle runs out of oxygen, or a faster use of the available oxygen. And then the muscle gets into burning lactate, and the muscle starts to fail. But here's the big difference. In addition to less volume or distance, about half as much, the muscle now is in a deeper oxygen deficit, similar to what altitude training does, but this is specifically in the muscles you're working doing your endurance training. And that has a specific adaptation in the body that's unlike anything most endurance athletes have ever seen. So number one, it's less work. Number two, it's a deeper fatigue. And number three, which is of significant benefits, because it's less volume, less load, it's less damage on the muscle and creates faster recovery. And the big thing it does here, which causes this exciting adaptation, is a bigger growth hormone surge. And when you get greater growth hormone surge, you get greater adaptation. Now let's go back and look at the same exercise. Again, running, swimming, biking, or doing bicep curls. The bands are on your arms or legs. And in this study, as you see on the right side, we're doing the same exercise, but with lighter weights, but the oxygen deficit in the muscle is now getting down way below 30%. Why is this happening? Again, the bands simply slow down blood flow out of the muscles. Thus, the muscle runs out of oxygen quicker, and the muscle then gets into an oxygen deficit in a much greater state. In this example of this study, you can see in that one part of the chart, about 2/3 of the way through, the oxygen deficit is actually below 10%. Now, this is a deficit that you cannot do with normal training. I don't care how far you run, how far you bike, how far you swim, how much weight you lift. You cannot push yourself down to this level of oxygen deficit. And here's what happens in the body. Let's look at the arm down there in the bottom left. The blood flow restriction device is on. It's not cutting off blood flow in either direction. As you're exercising and the muscle gets in this metabolic crisis by doing light exercise or oxygen deficit, it sends a signal up to the brain that there's a metabolic crisis going on. The brain responds by increasing heart rate, increasing breathing, increasing sweating, and increasing growth hormone. This is a normal response, but you're doing less work, and the body senses a much greater metabolic crisis in the muscle. And here is the profound thing that will happen in your athletic body that may have never happened in your entire life of training: a massive growth hormone release. On the top line, the study shows that exercising without BFR, so weight training, running, swimming, biking, gets a small increase in growth hormone. But when you put the bands on and exercise, the growth hormone in this study was 25 times greater. I want you to imagine going for a run or a swim or a biking session and doing a third or a half the distance, fatiguing quicker and fatiguing further into failure or that muscle burn, and getting a 25 times greater release of growth hormone. You can start to imagine how your body would adapt differently, how you could go further, have greater VO2 max, and actually blow through plateaus and decrease your times. Here's one study showing the results of what can happen. Now, this study is on doing strength training, which all of you should do with light weights and BFR bands, blood flow resistance bands like the B3 bands, versus traditional weights. And we're going to look at three things: strength, size, and endurance. This is a study out of Denmark on 34 men in great health, like all of our athletes who are running, swimming, and biking. In both the control group, the group that was doing knee extension exercises, and the group that was doing knee extension exercises with the BFR bands, they both had a similar increase in strength and a similar increase in size. But when they looked at VO2 max or endurance capacity in the muscle, the control group that was just doing knee extension exercises did not have any change in endurance. And this makes sense. Most of us know that if we go weight train, our endurance or VO2 max doesn't go up. We have to run to do that. But look what happened. The BFR group, the group that's doing strength training with the bands on, had a 28% increase in endurance capacity or VO2 max. This means that you can now strength train and get the benefits as if you're doing aerobic activity at the same time, which is an absolute game changer for endurance athletes who are also strength training, because now you're going to get the additional benefits of increasing your VO2 max while you're lifting light weights. Let's look at an endurance study. This is a study done in Japan on 19 men in excellent health. They did low-intensity cycle training at 3 times per week for 8 weeks. So your typical 30, 40, 50-minute cycling session. And they compared doing it with BFR bands on versus traditional. Now, in the control group that did not have the BFR bands on, there was no change in strength and size. This is what we would expect when we go out and run or swim or do biking, we don't necessarily expect our muscles to increase in strength and size. There was a small change in VO2 max. This is also what we're used to. Over time, we see with endurance training, small changes in VO2 max, and there was a small change in time to exhaustion, meaning an improvement in our endurance of 3.9%. Now look at the BFR group, doing the same thing but having the BFR bands on. A 7.7 increase in strength. Now doing running, swimming, and biking, we can increase strength. A 4% increase in quadricep size, and a very significant increase in VO2 max, 6.4%, and a 15% improvement in time to exhaustion. A completely different adaptation in the body, proving that doing endurance training with BFR bands is way more beneficial than traditional endurance training. Where traditional endurance training does not benefit strength and size, BFR training does. Where traditional endurance training has small changes in VO2 max and times to exhaustion, BFR training shows much greater improvements in those two categories. So this is a very exciting breakthrough in training that we can now do for our athletes that swim, bike, and run. First and foremost, this is now a way for all of you to reduce volume, which is training times. How many miles, how many minutes, how long you're going to do endurance training during the week, and reduce load on your body in both your endurance training and your weight training, which leads to less damage and shorter recovery and less toll on your body. And if you want to look at it even further, the less training you can do now, the longer your career or ability to perform these exercises is going to last in your life. But the big game changers, it's a quicker, deeper fatigue in the muscles, which uses the body's natural mechanisms to promote a much greater growth hormone surge, which results in increases in strength and size, increases in VO2 max and endurance. Every runner, biker, and swimmer should be implementing BFR training, either in 30% of your training or 60% of your training or 80% of your training. As you start using it, you will decide. But if you want to continue to improve, this is a new breakthrough in training, and it's the new way to train. It's been proven in Olympic athletes. It's been proven in Asia. Now, B3 Sciences has over 1,500 people that are using these bands from ages 8 to 80, and specifically for our endurance athletes, these are big game changers, reducing distance and volume, reducing loads, training further into exhaustion, less injury, faster recovery, greater hormone surges, and the ability, the big change here, for all of you to blow through plateaus that you've reached, whether you're recreational in your endurance training or competitive. This new way to train is going to absolutely change the game for you. Thanks for watching this presentation. Get back to the person who shared this with you to try the B3 bands. It will only take you one time, and it will only take you 5 to 10 minutes to put these bands on and go for a short swim, a short bike ride, or a short run for you to feel the incredible difference that happens when you've got the B3 bands on.